Good morning, colleagues. I think we can start. Excellencies, distinguished participants, colleagues, distinguished representatives, I hereby declare open the 62nd regular session of the Human Rights Council. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome Mr. Volker Türk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also Ms. AC1W, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, to her first Human Rights Council as Deputy High Commissioner. It is also a special pleasure to welcome 8 delegates who are here thanks to the generous support of donors of the Voluntary Technical Assistance Trust Fund to support the participation of least developed countries and small island developing states in the work of the Council. The delegates are from Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Guinea, Guyana, Federated States of Micronesia, Rwanda, Samoa, and Senegal. We look forward to their active participation in the Council. Distinguished representatives, allow me to address a few organizational and procedural matters to begin with. During the organizational meeting on June 1st, we discussed the draft program of work for the 62nd session, which can be found on the Council website and the extranet. The program of work is a living document subject to changes. So I encourage everyone to regularly check the SCED website or application for the latest updates. Following the Council's adoption of extraordinary cost and time-saving measures on June 1st, the session is expected to close on Tuesday, July 7th. Let me thank you in advance for your cooperation in respecting the speaking time limit in order to complete our work on time. As reflected in the minutes of the Bureau meeting of 8 June, the Council will meet on Friday, 19th June from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. So that's 9 to 12 on Friday, and from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. in order to accommodate the informal high-level discussion on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Human Rights Council, which is scheduled to take place that day from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. The latest draft of the program of work, dated 11th June, reflects this adjustment of the Council's working hours on 19th June. I wish to highlight that the current draft program of work includes the presentation of the report of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Myanmar. Allow me to recall that on 12th January this year, the Bureau took note of the Secretariat's explanation that the situation concerning the representation of Myanmar at the General Assembly had remained unchanged since 2021, and pending a change in the status quo in the Credentials Committee of the General Assembly on the representation of Myanmar, the Secretariat cannot process the registration of anyone as part of the delegation of Myanmar in the Council in 2026. Consequently, Myanmar is not represented in the Council in this session, the 62nd session. In this regard, and in line with the previous decisions of the Council since 2021, the Bureau agreed on June 8th to continue the past practice and propose to the Council that the presentation of the report of the High Commissioner mandated to take place during the 62nd session proceed as scheduled without the participation of the concerned country. Such a proposal is made on the basis that this exceptional circumstances does not set a precedent for the future. Are there any members of the Council wishing to comment on this proposal? I see no request for the floor. I take it that there is no objection, that the Council proceed with the presentation of the report of the High Council on the situation of human rights in Myanmar as scheduled, without the participation of the country concerned. It is so decided. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, I now propose that the Council approve the draft program of work with the understanding that it is a living document. Does any member of the Council wish to comment on this proposal? I see none. The program of work for this session is approved. It is so decided. Excellencies, distinguished representative, the online system for the inscription of the lists of speakers for all interactive dialogue and panel discussion opened on Wednesday, June 10th, and closes 24 hours before the meeting in which the respective dialogue or discussion is scheduled to begin. Once the online inscription has closed, delegations may still inscribe or withdraw by sending email to the list of speakers desk. The list of speakers will close approximately 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate. With regard to the inscriptions on the list of speakers for interactive and enhanced interactive dialogues, except for the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on his annual report, delegations must indicate their preference in the online inscription system, as they do for panel discussions. I recall that this has been the practice since the Council's 59th session. Interested states are asked to rank dialogues in order of their priorities. Speaking slots are allocated by the system taking into account their priorities. If the number of states indicating the highest priority for a particular dialogue exceeds the maximum number of available speaking slots, the slots will be allocated on a first-come, first-served basis. The online system for inscription on the list of speakers for the adoptions of the UPR outcomes opened today, June 15 at 9 a.m. and closed on Thursday, 18th June at 6 p.m. No inscriptions will be possible after this deadline. For national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, the list of speakers for all debates opened on Tuesday, 9th June at 2 p.m. I kindly request that all participants upload the Word version of their oral statements through the online system for the list of speakers. If this is not possible, please send them by email to the conference services and the Council Secretariat. Now, turning to draft proposals, allow me to recall that the deadline for the submissions of draft proposal for the 62nd session is Thursday, 25th June at 1 p.m. I encourage sponsors to table draft proposals as early as possible. The submission of a proposal after the deadline needs prior approval by the Council before it is registered by the Secretariat. Only under exceptional circumstances would an extension of the deadline for submission of draft proposals be approved by the Council, and for a maximum of 24 hours. Let me also underline that in accordance with Resolution 5/1, delegations are invited to conduct open-ended informal consultations to secure the broadest possible support for their initiatives. At least one open-ended informal consultation should be held on each draft resolution and/or decision before it is considered for action by the Council. In the interest of ensuring the effective participation of all stakeholders in the work of the Human Rights Council, I encourage main sponsors of draft proposals to share draft text with civil society organizations and other observers that follow informal consultations. Excellencies, the effective conduct of the Council sessions as well as the fulfillment of its mandate rests upon a constructive, safe, and respectful environment. Disagreement with mandate holders and their reports can always be expressed. However, It is unacceptable for them to be insulted, personally attacked, threatened, or subjected to efforts aimed at undermining their independence and integrity when discharging their mandates. So that is unacceptable, and it should be unacceptable to all of us. Let me also reiterate my deep concern and regret at the personal attacks and unlawful unilateral sanctions directed against certain mandate holders of the Council. Such practices are incompatible with the spirit of cooperation and dialogue that must underpin our work. This is consistency between presidents of the Council. Now, turning to reprisals, the active participation of representatives of civil society and national human rights institutions is an essential component of the Human Rights Council. As President, I will follow up on all reported allegations of reprisals and intimidation committed against individuals or groups who have cooperated with the Council and its mechanisms. I call on all of us to take all necessary steps to prevent such acts from taking place in the first place and to ensure that they are promptly and seriously addressed in case that they do occur. Excellencies, colleagues, let me also emphasize that the United Nations, including this Council, has zero tolerance for any form of harassment, including sexual harassment. The UNOC Director General has pledged to implement the Code of Conduct to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment, at UN system events. The Bureau encourages all delegations to be aware of and fully uphold a zero-tolerance policy and comply with the Code of Conduct. Delegations chairing informal consultations should consider reminding the participants in their meetings of the rules of participation to help prevent such incidents. I would encourage those who chair meetings, including informal discussions, to also share the Code of Conduct on this matter with their colleagues. Moreover, allow me to recall that Her Excellency, Ms. Caroline Ziadeh, is serving this Council as the gender focal point, including for cases of sexual harassment at meetings and events of the Human Rights Council. I encourage everyone to refer to the webpage on the conduct of participants in the meetings and events of the Human Rights Council to learn more about preventing harassment and sexual harassment and how to report an incident when one does occur. You see on the screen the website about the conduct of participants. I encourage all delegations to refer to it. All complaints will be and would have to be dealt with promptly. Turning to the issue of accessibility, His Excellency Mr. Segap Kebekau Daka, Vice President of the Council, is the chair of the Task Force on Accessibility. There is also a focal point for accessibility within the Secretariat. Delegations are requested to upload their oral statements in Word format so that they are accessible to persons with disabilities. Speeches in PDF or other non-accessible formats will not be posted on the extranet. Let me also invite delegations to consider including language mandating accessibility in panel discussions when drafting relevant resolutions. This is the only way to ensure live captioning and sign language interpretation will be provided. So that is with the organizational matters. Excellencies, distinguished representative, I now declare open Agenda Item 2, entitled Annual Report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Reports of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. This agenda item will remain open throughout the session. I now have the pleasure of giving the floor to Mr. Volker Türk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the presentation of his annual report. You have that.
Terima kasih. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the struggle for human rights is a story of enormous progress followed by regression, of advances and losses, of steps forwards, backwards, and sideways. But the trajectory is clear. Ultimately, it's towards larger freedom. This global update is a snapshot of a complex mosaic that defies binary ideas of good or bad, allies or enemies. Clearly, we face very serious human rights challenges. An unprecedented, shameless onslaught against international law is causing appalling human suffering. We must call it out every time and everywhere and work to contain and end it. At the same time, the nuts and bolts of human rights work are delivering safety, dignity and freedom for millions of people every day. Away from the headlines, human rights are improving lives, healing divisions and creating opportunities. The Universal Declaration and the core treaties are ever more important. Little wonder then, when they are asked, huge majorities of people say they want more human rights, not less. I never forget the words of Nobel laureate Toni Morrison when she says, "The very serious function of racism is distraction." Let's not get distracted. Let's forge on with our work to promote and protect human rights and do everything possible to strengthen their legal foundations. Just one global agreement, the Convention Against Landmines, for example, helped reduce casualties from these heinous weapons by over 75% between 1999 and the early 2020s. Many perpetrators of atrocity crimes would never have been prosecuted without human rights work. Human rights need to be front and center of today's pressing issues, from the climate crisis to guidelines around artificial intelligence, from the Ebola outbreak to the Men's World Cup. And I encourage G7 leaders meeting across the lake to put human rights at the core of their discussions as a force for stability and progress. Mr. President, I welcome the announcement that the United States and Iran have agreed on a peace deal that provides for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and a framework for further negotiations. The conflict has had a devastating impact on human rights across the region and around the world. The last months have shown that the deep differences in the region cannot be resolved by military means. I deplore the use of force against Iran by Israel and the United States, which reportedly killed thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children, and destroyed hospitals, schools, homes, and other infrastructure. I again call for the findings of the US investigation into the horrific attack on Minab School to be made public. Iran's attacks on civilian infrastructure in Gulf countries and Jordan and its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz are completely unacceptable. The blockade has had dire consequences for the global economy, for the delivery of humanitarian aid, and for the most vulnerable, including some 20,000 seafarers. And the Deputy High Commissioner will brief you on this later today. I feel deeply for the people in Iran caught between war and cruel repression. Since killing thousands of people during the egregious crushing of protests in January this year, the authorities have intensified their brutal crackdown, arresting thousands and imposing even more severe restrictions on civic space. They have executed at least 40 people on national security grounds so far this year, including 18 protesters. Mr. President, at this fragile moment, it is clear all sides need to exercise maximum restraint and work to implement the agreement reached quickly and in good faith. In Gaza, Israeli forces have killed almost 1,000 Palestinians since the ceasefire was announced last October. The vast majority civilians. The Israeli authorities are pushing Palestinians into an ever-shrinking portion of the territory and imposing restrictions on life-saving aid. On the West Bank, Israeli security forces and settlers are accelerating the destruction of communities and the annexation of territory. So far this year, they have killed 57 people, injured nearly 1,300, detained hundreds, and issued 23 land confiscation orders. Meanwhile, since the ceasefire, we have recorded at least 82 reported killings of Palestinians by Hamas. Some senior Israeli officials have spoken publicly of the removal of all Palestinians from Gaza and of ending any possibility of a viable Palestinian state. All of this is totally illegal. We are out of red flags. Our many previous warnings have not been heeded. All those with influence must exert pressure to make the ceasefire a reality, to end the unbearable suffering of Palestinians, and to hold those responsible to account. Mr. President, the renewed escalation between Hezbollah and Israel since 2nd of March has dragged the Lebanese people once again into a war that is not of their making. And I hope yesterday's announcement will also bring them much-needed relief. I'm alarmed by widespread Israeli strikes on populated areas and essential infrastructure. Some 3,600 people are reported killed, including hundreds of women and children, and more than 11,000 injured. Together with large-scale displacement orders, these attacks have forced more than 1 million people from their homes. At the same time, Hezbollah is launching sophisticated, far-reaching attacks into Israel, causing civilian deaths and injuries. 26 civilians have reportedly been killed across Israel since late February in the hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran. I call for an immediate end to hostilities, the withdrawal of Israel from Lebanese territory, and investigations into violations by all parties of international humanitarian and human rights law. We are deploying our own independent and impartial assessment mission to Lebanon in agreement with the government. Mr. President, in Sudan, the horrific conflict has expanded and escalated, marked by a sharp increase in the use of drone warfare. Between January and May 26, our office documented more than 1,000 civilians killed by drone strikes. Rape and sexual violence are rampant. In Ukraine, it is deeply concerning that the horrendous war has escalated sharply in recent months. My team verified that more than 7,000 civilians were killed or injured in the first 5 months of 2026, more than during the same period in any of the previous 3 years. The human rights and security situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo remains highly volatile. Clashes between the Congolese armed forces and armed groups in North and South Kivu are complicating the response to the deadly Ebola virus, and we will provide more details to the Council on these 3 situations. Mr. President, I'm appalled by the reckless, wanton approach to human life that characterizes some of today's global decision-making. We are seeing a global shift in how war is waged. In Sudan, long-range drones have destroyed aid convoys, and I saw myself vital energy infrastructure. In Ukraine, relentless drone attacks have caused mass casualties and terrorized civilians. In the DRC, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, and Myanmar, drone warfare is creating a new circle of hell. The UN has warned for many years against the development of lethal autonomous weapons. This reality is now upon us. States urgently need to consider the moral and legal questions this raises, agree on a common approach that protects civilian lives, and recommit to diplomacy and mediation. We must update legal frameworks to require human control and ensure accountability. Autonomous weapons cannot become a license for atrocity crimes. The prospect of billion-dollar AI-enabled weapons brought down by billion-dollar AI-enabled defensive shields exposes the horror, emptiness, and futility of war. Security experts warn that unrestrained military operations that flatten entire areas are fueling grievances and contributing to a new generation of extremists. They can never lead to lasting security. We need a much stronger focus on the financial drivers of this nihilism. Who benefits? We need to replace war economies with human rights economies. Mr. President, partout dans le monde,
people around the world are crying out for action anchored in human rights to de-escalate tensions and prevent conflict. The Central Sahel is at a dangerous tipping point. In Mali, extremist armed groups launched coordinated attacks on several cities and towns in April, causing mass civilian casualties. I am concerned about reports that security forces carried out extrajudicial killings, abducted political opponents, and detained prominent journalists for doing their jobs. In Burkina Faso, extremist armed groups continue to attack, kidnap, and threaten civilians. I deplore that the authorities have dissolved or suspended more than 930 civil society organizations since April. Attacks by extremist armed groups in Niger are growing, and the formation of so-called self-defense groups raises serious risks of abuses and intercommunal violence. No one has been held accountable for violations reportedly committed by the military. In Cameroon, the security situation in the northwest and southwest regions remains deeply concerning as security forces and armed separatist groups are implicated in unlawful killings and kidnappings. At least 20 people were reportedly killed in April 2026 alone.
I urge the authorities to conduct a prompt and independent investigation into airstrikes by the military that reportedly killed more than 100 civilians in the north in May. I'm also deeply concerned by repeated abductions of school children and teachers. In Ethiopia, the armed conflict in Amhara and Oromia continues unabated as the warring parties kill, abduct, rape, arrest, and detain civilians. I continue to be worried about the situation in Tigray. Reports of violence involving Orthodox Christians and Muslims in Oromia reflect a concerning escalation of intercommunal tensions. Somalia faces heightened insecurity and humanitarian needs. Proposed electoral reforms have triggered an uptick in tensions and violence. My new office, agreed recently, will work to support the Somali people. In Haiti, gang violence has resulted in at least 2,300 deaths, 1,100 injuries, and 99 kidnappings since the start of the year. I urge the authorities to move quickly on the judicial units to tackle impunity. The gang suppression force is urgently needed, and it needs to operate in line with international human rights law.
Cuba is in the throes of a human rights emergency. It is suffocating under US sanctions. The alarm is flashing red. We need urgent de-escalation. In Peru, the next government will need to prioritize the restoration of the rule of law, the independence of judicial institutions, and a national dialogue to heal a deeply divided society.
In Syria, thousands of victims and survivors demand justice and accountability. The prosecution of the former president and other officials, while at this point mostly in absentia, is an important step. These proceedings need to respect international standards, and more must follow. My office is working to support transitional justice and promote reconciliation. The Syrian people need to be able to build their own future without outside interference. In Yemen, I call again for the immediate and unconditional release by the de facto Houthi authorities of personnel from the United Nations, civil society organizations and diplomatic missions, including 8 of my own staff. These detentions are utterly unacceptable. Mr. President, cuts to aid around the world are having a catastrophic impact on human rights. Total humanitarian needs for this year are equivalent to just 3 days of global military spending. The funding needed by my office across this entire year is less than what the world spends on weapons and soldiers in 2 hours. Unless we change course, poverty and hunger will spike. Tensions will escalate and more people will be forced from their homes along unsafe migration routes. And this affects everyone and no country is immune. Instability, inequalities and weak governance are fertile ground for extremism and conflict. They also fuel transnational crime, including the trade in illicit drugs worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Criminal groups are exploiting global crisis, conflict and migration to expand their activities from Afghanistan to Guinea-Bissau to the Sahel and the Americas. Violence associated with drug trafficking has risen sharply in many countries along trafficking routes. Meanwhile, the so-called war on drugs has become a vicious circle. Militarized responses, particularly in the Americas, feed further violence. The United States of America has reportedly killed more than 200 people in airstrikes against civilian ships in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Calling these attacks part of a war on narco-terrorism does not justify them. Illicit drugs are also having a massive negative impact on our climate and environment, from water stress to deforestation and the dumping of toxic waste. Governments need to tackle corruption, strengthen institutions, and invest in harm reduction, education, healthcare, and jobs. Mr. President, in my last global update, I spoke of the authoritarian playbook. It's growing thicker by the day. Our preliminary data indicates that some 950 human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists were killed or forcibly disappeared worldwide in 2025, more than double the number a decade ago. In Uganda, for example, the new Protection of Sovereignty Act strengthens state control over civil society organizations. In Belarus, Iran, and Russia, thousands of human rights activists and journalists are criminalized and prosecuted as terrorists and extremists. In Serbia, the demands of anti-corruption protests remain unanswered for many months, while the human rights situation is deteriorating. In India, following welcome court decisions to grant bail to human rights defenders who have been in lengthy pre-trial detention, I urge their immediate release. Attacks against the environmental human rights defenders are rising. Our latest figures show they are detained in at least 55 countries. Media censorship is growing, while freedom of expression declining in 44 countries, according to several surveys. Globally, my office has recorded more than 800 journalists and media workers behind bars, including citizen journalists and human rights bloggers. Most recently, journalists have been prosecuted under vague charges in Tunisia and Turkey. And in Gabon, Iran, the Republic of the Congo, and Russia, authorities curtailed access to information through internet shutdowns. In Zambia forced the cancellation of RightsCon, the world's largest digital tech and human rights conference. Around the world, particularly in Southeast and East Asia and parts of Africa, Central Asia, Europe, and Central America, transnational repression is increasingly used as a tool of persecution across borders to pursue government critics and human rights defenders. A number of governments are even misusing Interpol processes for this purpose. We need to put a much stronger focus on this. Mr. President, history shows that authoritarians have often succeeded in confining millions of people within a parallel reality of conspiracies and lies. Today's extreme concentration of political, economic, and technological power is facilitating this. When we consider the staggering sums spent by tech tycoons on lobbying, it is clear that today's innovation often serves private interests rather than the public good. Meanwhile, we are offered new products, such as AI classes, that establish ever more sophisticated shields between people and reality. I wish someone would invent classes that help us see the humanity in each other instead. Some tech companies and countries, particularly in the European Union, are considering age-related restrictions on social media as part of their efforts to protect children online. My office's new guidelines on AI and children's rights can help to ensure that these measures are grounded in human rights. The organized backlash against gender equality forms one of the thickest chapters of the authoritarian playbook. Violence against women is treated as a sad but acceptable fact against a backdrop of misogynistic rhetoric and aggressive online content. The so-called manosphere monetizes harmful stereotypes that undermine the rights of both young men and women. Recent surveys show that Gen Z men in many countries are more opposed to women's independence than their grandfathers. Afghanistan's new law implying the legitimization of child marriage aggravates the agony of Afghan women and girls. It is despicable and must be abolished, together with all other serious discriminatory measures. Russia is intensifying its persecution of LGBTIQ+ communities. In the past 3 months alone, at least 9 organizations protecting their rights have been designated extremist. I deplore the Ghanaian parliament's decision to pass a bill with harsher criminal sanctions against LGBTQ+ people and human rights defenders, and I urge the President not to sign this law. I also deplore the adoption of legal provisions in Niger that criminalize consensual same-sex relationships with severe sanctions. 6 years after the death of George Floyd, the knee is still on the necks of many black people around the world. White nationalist groups complain about supposed double standards and two-tier policing. But the facts show that across regions, police are several times more likely to use force against people of African descent. The dehumanization of migrants and refugees, including in the UK, US, and many EU countries, is appalling, often leading also to the denial of their rights. The European Union's new rules on returning migrants risk expanding the use of detention, establishing offshore return hubs, and weakening safeguards against refoulement. I'm also worried about growing pressure from some states on the European Court of Human Rights around migration and refugee law. I'm particularly concerned about the continuing trend of involuntary returns of Afghan asylum seekers and refugees from countries, including Iran and Pakistan, to Afghanistan in breach of international refugee law. In South Africa, poverty and inequalities are driving social tensions, including xenophobia and violence against migrants and refugees. I trust the government will make good on its pledge to put human rights at the heart of its response. Mega sports events are supposed to bring people together in unity and peace. It is troubling to see how immigration enforcement is impacting the Men's World Cup. My plea to the US authorities is that they provide safety and dignity to all players, officials and supporters. And I urge all governments to address refugee and migration issues humanely and in full compliance with the tried and tested rules of international human rights and refugee law. Mr. President, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, as well as attacks and discrimination against indigenous peoples and ethnic and religious minorities are widespread and in many cases rising. We need an all-out effort to curb this phenomenon. I'm very concerned about China's counterterrorism and assimilation policies, particularly as they affect minorities in the Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia and Tibetan regions. The new law on ethnic unity risks deepening restrictions on freedoms of language, education, practice of religion, culture, expression and assembly, and penalizing the peaceful exercise of minority rights in general. I call for the law to be repealed and for these practices to end. Nicaragua stands alone in not engaging with the human rights system at all. The recent death in custody of indigenous leader Brooklyn Rivera is the latest proof of its repressive policies and broader patterns of violations against indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. Mr. President, the social and economic costs of the crisis I've mentioned ripple across generations and the wider world. Young voters in many countries feel alienated and ignored. They demand their human rights as a ladder to better life. Last month, in the Republic of Korea, I saw how Gwangju and other human rights cities are improving people's lives with equitable policies on transport, healthcare, education, and more. During my recent visit to Mongolia, I was encouraged that the authorities are using the recommendations of human rights bodies to advance reform. Comprehensive anti-discrimination laws strengthen social cohesion and build trust within communities. My office is supporting countries with such legislation. I welcome recent legal successes. In Australia, for example, an indigenous group secured record compensation for mining without their consent. In China, the Supreme Court recognized that discrimination and bullying against lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people violate their human rights. And I trust that the appointment of the new Attorney General in Guatemala will strengthen democracy in practice. Across all regions, from Benin to Montenegro, from the Philippines to Slovakia and Spain, national human rights institutions are supporting victims of violations, safeguarding civic space, and combating online hate speech. Regional mechanisms also play an important role. Regional courts in Latin America, Africa, and Europe are holding states to account for environmental harms from Nigeria and Peru to Switzerland and beyond. The African Union Compliance Framework for Peace Operations has helped build a culture of accountability. Despite significant challenges, the Association of Southeast Asian States, ASEAN, can play a crucial mediating role to resolve the conflict in Myanmar. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has proven to be a successful path towards justice for victims, from arbitrary detention to privacy rights and more. The international human rights system has also proven its value. The work of my own staff sheds light in the darkest corners. It has been cited in high-profile legal cases, including by the International Court of Justice, and has influenced hundreds of legal reforms. Investigations mandated by this Council have helped bring perpetrators of international crimes to justice. It's a significant achievement as the Council marks its 20th anniversary. For example, the Commission of Inquiry on Syria has cooperated directly with over 63 criminal investigations into war crimes and crimes against humanity committed since 2011. Human rights shape judicial thinking at national and regional levels. The Swiss Supreme Court has referred to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in more than 300 of its decisions. Treaty bodies have advanced legal and policy reform through their recommendations, including on abolishing the death penalty and on women's sexual and reproductive health rights. I condemn disinformation campaigns and attempts to undermine the credibility of the UN human rights system, including special procedure mandate holders. Criticism and debate are legitimate and necessary. Efforts to intimidate, to discredit, or even sanction are not. They are unacceptable. Mr. President, human rights work is always unfinished business. We can never take anything for granted, and those on the front lines know that. I think of the human rights defenders that I met recently in Sudan, in Mongolia, in Mexico, and in many other countries, all struggling in different ways, all showing courage and tenacity every day. We know how much human rights can unite us, which is why we launched the Global Alliance for Human Rights last week. Over the next 2 years, this alliance will become a hive of activity, with different groups and communities around the world, making new connections and building new partnerships. Human rights are the glue that binds us together, and when we join forces to strengthen those bonds, we do build a better world for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Let me remind all delegates that the interactive dialogue on the High Commissioner's annual report is scheduled to begin tomorrow morning. And now let's take a short technical break.